In this video, I'm going to show y'all how I install fiberglass bat insulation for a professional and quality job, plus give you some tips and tricks. All this and more is coming right up. Hey everyone, well if you're new, welcome to the channel where we're working on turning this 1960s old cattle farm into our homestead. So we're in our kitchen today. I know it's been a long time since some of y'all seen inside the house. So we've been working all summer and through the winter gutting this kitchen. We've removed all the old cabinets that were put in back in 1965. We've took down all the paneling off the walls. We ripped out all the old insulation that was in the wall. And today we're going to be working on putting new insulation in these exterior walls. Well, real quick before we get started, I want to go over some of the tools that you're going to need for this job. We've got a good pair of safety glasses, some gloves, and a nice quality respirator here. There will be a little bit of insulation dust, messing with insulation, so you want to have a good quality respirator. For the sake of this video, I won't be wearing a respirator just because I'll be talking to the camera, but I do recommend having a good quality respirator. So you'll need a good sharp utility knife, a tape measure, some sort of stapler with staples, and it might also be a good idea to just have a straight edge or a level around for cutting the insulation. Now when it comes to the stapler, you can use a handheld stapler, but I recommend having a pneumatic stapler or battery powered. So you'll see in just a little bit why I recommend having some type of powered stapler. I just happen to have a pneumatic stapler. You can pick these up for really cheap. I got this one probably 5 years ago at my local big box store for I think around $30, and I have put in well over 10,000 staples with this little staple gun. So I have a large air compressor right here that I use most of the time, but you don't have to have a large one. So you can pick up a little air compressor that'll do just fine. I picked this one up the other day for $40, brand new. So you can find them cheap, but I do recommend having a powered stapler over a hand staple, even though this will work just fine. So what we're going to be working with today is fiberglass bat insulation. It's faced, which means it has a paper vapor barrier on one side. We're going to be working with what's called a fast bat. It comes in these big bags. So these fast bats come pre-cut 15 inches wide, which is your standard stud cavity for 16 inch on center, 93 inches tall, which is your standard height for your stud for an 8-foot ceiling. You can also get these in a roll. I think they're like 30 feet long, and that's for instances where you have a taller or shorter ceiling height. When I open these bags, I like to cut them open from the side so that I don't cut the paper vapor barrier that's on the top and bottom of these bundles. So when installing these, we want to start at the top to make sure that we get this insulation pushed all the way up to this top plate here and poked all the way back into the hole. We don't want to compress this insulation because that's when it loses its R value rating. We want to make sure this insulation is nice and fluffed up, that it's sticking up all the way to the top plate here. And what a lot of people will do sometimes is just shove this in this cavity and call it good. But that is not the correct way to do this. This paper vapor barrier serves a couple purposes. Number one, when you staple it to the studs, it keeps this insulation from falling down and settling over time, and then you have a void spot here that doesn't have any insulation, and you lose a lot of heat and cooling through this over time. This will eventually settle down if you do not staple this to your studs. Now there's two different ways that you can staple this insulation to the studs. You can face staple it, which is the way that I prefer, and then you can also do what they call an inset staple and staple it to the inside of the studs here, leaving the face of the studs nice and clean. So it's always a good idea to check with your local building codes and your local building inspector to make sure that they don't have a preference on which way you do this. I prefer to face staple instead of inset staple for a couple reasons. So the first reason is this insulation is pre-made to fit a certain size stud cavity. In this case, it's a 2x6 stud, which is 5.5 inches thick, and therefore the insulation is 5.5 inches thick. If we inset this, the 1-inch wide flange of this paper, we're compressing this insulation an inch, which then reduces its R value. And the second reason I don't like the inset staple is you can't get this stretched out and sealed off as good as you can as if you face staple it. When you face staple it, you can really stretch this vapor barrier tight, overlapping the joints here on the vapor barrier, and that just helps a little bit more to reduce your draft from around your insulation. And it does a better job of providing a moisture barrier. So this is why I like to face staple over insetting staple. So now that we got this pushed up to this top plate real good, we don't have a gap here. I like to peel this paper back just a little bit and pull it up on this top plate. And go ahead and tack both corners. And this staple gun is a little bit old, so it doesn't always shoot a staple. And sometimes when it does shoot a staple, it goes through the paper. So every time that I'm shooting this, I'm not actually putting a staple in. Once we've got the top tacked real good, we're going to push the rest of this insulation into the stud cavity, making sure that it's filling all the voids and making sure it's filling up the whole depth of the stud cavity. Now we're just going to work our way down, stretching this vapor barrier and tacking it in, making sure that we get a good overlap and a nice tight vapor barrier. We're going to work this all the way down until we hit an obstacle that we have to work around. So we're just going to continue to push this in very lightly. We just want to tuck this in and make sure that we fold out these edges on this vapor barrier. We're going to work our way down one side and then come over to the other side and stretch it tight. Once we get to a point where we've run into some obstacles here, we have an electrical wire here and also a receptacle box. So what we want to do is we want to separate this fiberglass insulation about half and half. We're going to fold the top section up, and we're actually going to poke this back section behind the receptacle box and the electrical wire. That way we're not compressing any of this insulation up against this electrical wire. And we also have insulation behind this receptacle box, providing good R value and stopping any draft coming through the receptacle box itself. Then we're just going to fold down the rest of this and continue in stapling. I've already cut out around this receptacle here for this demonstration. We have a lot more insulation to install around the corner here in the kitchen that I'll be showing you how we cut around this. And what we'll do, for instance, where you may have a stud cavity that is not this exact opening for your insulation. So now you can see why I definitely recommend either a pneumatic stapler or a battery powered stapler. I do like to put in a lot of staples to make sure that we have a good seal on our vapor barrier and to make sure that this insulation doesn't settle over time. Even though this is something that you're not going to see once you get your finished wall installed, this is a very important step that you want to make sure that you do properly. So now that we've moved over to the kitchen, we're going to continue to install these just like we did in the demonstration, starting at the top, pulling everything tight, and working our way on down the stud cavity till we get to another wire that we have to go behind, poking everything in tight, and then stapling it off. So when you get to a receptacle box, all you want to do is trace around the receptacle box with your razor blade, trying to stay as close up to the receptacle box as you can. And you want to make sure that you cut all the way through the insulation to where you can fit the rest of it around the receptacle box. Once you pull that little piece out, I like to separate about a third of it. And then the third that I took apart, I like to put behind the receptacle box to make sure that I have some insulation behind the receptacle box. Then we're just going to continue to staple the rest of it, making sure we pull everything tight and getting it all secured in place. Once we come to a stud cavity that is not your standard height, what I'll do is I'll measure it. Whatever that measurement is, I'll add an inch to it when I transfer that over to the insulation. One little tip that I can give you right here is when you go to cut this insulation, find a spot in between the letters and just follow that to make a straight cut across. On the width of the stud cavity here, you can see this is exactly 11 inches wide. We don't want to cut this 11 inches. We want to cut it about a ½ inch to an inch wider. That allows the insulation to fit nice and snug in the stud cavity and give you a little bit of paper to overlap on top of the studs. To transfer this measurement onto the insulation, I just mark it through the paper again. And in this case, you can see that it's kind of right in between the red line and the lettering on the paper here. So I just eyeball that and follow it as closely as I can. And cutting it an inch wider gives you a little bit of play on each side in case your cut isn't exactly straight. It gives you a little bit of forgiveness. Well, I really hope this has helped some of y'all out for your next time installing insulation. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please consider doing that and giving this video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it. We're going to have a lot more content here on the channel on renovations and stuff as we work on fixing up this old farmhouse here. We're in the kitchen, so we're going to be doing a lot of videos on remodeling this old kitchen. I hope everybody's enjoyed this video. We'll see y'all in the next one.